I had the good fortune to be on a panel a few years ago with Vincent on the topic, does science undermine biblical faith? Very, very fine, wonderful time with a whole lot of students there and a lot of good questions that really rolled for a good period of time. In June of this year, Vincent published a book entitled The Bible and Science, Longing for God in a Science-Dominated World. And one of the strengths of the book is that it really unpacks what we mean when we say and use the word Bible, particularly in the work of Hitchens and Dawkins and some others. Their attack on biblical faith is appalling because it's grounded in such total ignorance of Scripture and the scholarship on Scripture. So I think Vincent has made a really unique contribution. Tonight, he's giving us a slightly different take on that topic, a very provocative title, The Bible and Science as Allies in this conversation. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Dr. Vincent Smiles.
Thank you, John, for that kind welcome. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure. I'm hoping that this will be as much of a conversation, a dialogue, as me just lecturing. So I'm going to try and get through this in no more than about 35 minutes, I hope. If at any point, however, even as I'm talking, you really feel that you want to ask a question or make a comment, disagree about something, I won't object if you kind of wave at me, and I'll just stop and we can have some discussion. I do think that the discussion is probably the best part of what we might do tonight, so don't hesitate to launch into me if you want to do so. Since the Bible and science both derive from human subjectivity, then both alike witness to the mind's capacity for transcendence. All knowledge, awareness, contemplation, desire for truth, all of the stuff which makes up the stuff of Bible and science, they all have a common source, human subjectivity. That much is a simple fact, easily verifiable by just a little thought. The new atheism, however, that aggressive attack on religious faith, represented by people like Richard Dawkins, you got to get his first name right there, and Sam Harris and a few others, no worries. That new atheism does not dwell much on the notion that theology and science have the same origin in human subjectivity. Indeed, as we will see, for them, human subjectivity doesn't count for much at all. They imagine that science represents a victory over subjectivity, and that by the scientific method, they have reached out to discover that reality is made up only of the stuff that is discoverable and measurable by the natural sciences. The mind itself, for them, is just a gene machine. There's a couple of quotes later on you will see to that effect. Science, they think, demonstrates that the inner world of human subjectivity is full of illusions and superstition. Only with the liberating methods of science can humans truly seek the truth. These are some of the primary names of the new atheism. That phrase, the new atheism, is of course a phrase concocted by the one who gives a very definite and strong answer to them, John Hort of Georgetown University. For the new atheists, the world is a meaningless chaos that is devoid of God. This is Christopher Hitchens, who says, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. If you think about that quotation for a little while, you see what a very narrow-minded, not to mention rather silly statement that it is, and yet nevertheless it more or less encapsulates the attitude of many of these new atheists. My thesis tonight is that the Bible and science together witness against the new atheism. because they both alike witness to the transcendent realm of reality, which accounts for the mind, and from which both theology and science derive. One of the great myths of the modern world is that science is the source of all knowledge, the answer to all of our problems. Either we look to science, says the myth, or we accept a state of ignorance and darkness. Carl Sagan was actually not among the new atheists. He died a few years ago, as you probably know. He was a soft atheist. But nevertheless, just look at the title of his book. One of his books. He wrote many, of course. Science, The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And of course, this title itself simply presupposes that before science, all was darkness. Apart from science, all is darkness. The name of this myth is scientism. It's important here to emphasize two things. In criticizing science, I'm in no way criticizing science itself. I accept the conclusions of science, including Darwinism, modern cosmology. There's no criticism of science itself. The second, even more important point to emphasize is that scientism is a philosophy that has nothing essentially to do with science itself. It's a philosophy that some people derive from science, but it's a self-contradictory philosophy. It's self-contradictory because its fundamental claim is that real knowledge only derives from science. But of course, that claim cannot be verified by science. The philosophy fails its own most basic test. In spite of this weakness, scientism is amazingly influential and popular. It sells books. So I want to go now to something of a historical review. And this historical view I like to call the agony of modernity. I'm speaking here primarily about the Enlightenment, what is often called the Age of Reason. I focus on the Enlightenment, but of course the modern world is the product also of the Renaissance, the discoveries of Columbus, the Reformation, Luther's protest against the corruptions of the medieval church, and so on. But for the most part, it is the 18th century Enlightenment which has given us what we call the modern world. And in general, we mostly think of the advantages of modernity. Prior to the 18th century, not only was there no electric light and no central heating, smartphones, airplanes, and all of the modern conveniences of modern technology, but there was also no such thing as democracy and the establishment of individual human rights. Women were commonly presumed to be less capable both physically and intellectually. Prior to modernity, slavery was practiced and defended as a matter of course, even sometimes by Catholic moral theologians. The advances of modernity are what the philosopher Ken Wilber properly calls the dignity of modernity. With respect to the expansion of knowledge and reason in this era, the great dignity of modernity was the differentiation of spheres of knowledge: art, aesthetics, empirical science, and religion morals. In the Middle Ages, these spheres of cultural value were not only undifferentiated, they were also almost exclusively controlled by the church, usually supported by the local prince or king. Indeed, church and state were themselves largely undifferentiated. Well into the 18th century, as the American Revolution throwing out the British attests, how dare you, but there you go. I'm from England originally, just in case you are wondering. Well into the 18th century, there was no such thing as the separation of church and state. Thus, Galileo's science, for instance, was still seen in the early 17th century as a threat to the world of religion. But the same lack of differentiation obtained in other areas. You can just think, for instance, of the art world. With the Enlightenment, however, art, science, and morals began to be clearly differentiated. A person could pursue the truth in one area without interference from the authority of the others. You could look through a telescope and no longer fear for papal wrath for reporting your findings. You could devise a philosophy that no longer conformed to church tradition, and you were no longer in danger of running foul of the Inquisition. We today look back on these accomplishments of the Enlightenment, these differentiations of knowledge, with the clear conviction that they represent human progress, which none of us today would want to be lost. With all of these accomplishments, how could anyone speak of the disaster of modernity? Potentially, we might think of various disasters. For example, of how science and technology quickly allied with the military-industrial complex to produce the most horrendous weapons of mass destruction the world has ever seen. And then, of course, they used them against one another in two horrible world wars, not to mention the Holocausts which went along with especially the Second World War. Or you might think of the way in which the powers of Europe turned their technological advantages against native peoples all over the world, from Australia to Africa, from the Americas to Asia. Speaking of this, John Hort, the Catholic philosopher, John Caputo, Catholic philosopher, has said, because the Enlightenment had too narrow an idea of what reason means and too chauvinistic of an idea of where it is to be found, for the longest time it placed the crown of reason on white male European heads, whose duty it was, it said, with its eyes cast heavenward, to spread Euro-white maledom around the globe. So there are various disasters which have come along with modernity in addition to its dignities. The particular disaster that I want to focus on tonight, however, has to do with what happened to the differentiations of art, aesthetics, empirical science, and ethics religion, which I mentioned a moment ago. These differentiations were significant accomplishments. They are part of the dignity of modernity. But it is also the case that the differentiations quickly went too far. They became dissociations. Ken Wilber, the American philosopher, says it well. Not only did art, morals, and science differentiate, which was necessary and beneficial, they soon began dramatically to dissociate or fly apart. This was a disaster, for it very soon allowed a powerful monological science to colonialize and dominate the other spheres, the aesthetic expressive and the religious moral, mostly by denying them any real existence at all. We can see why this has been a disaster if we consider the general presumption about human reality, which dominated most cultures for thousands of years prior to the Enlightenment. Wilber calls this the great nest of being. Human cultures, as illustrated clearly in Genesis, have always recognized their frail physical nature. In Genesis, God made humans from the dust of the ground. In other words, from the same material as God made the animals. After the rebellion, therefore, humans are told, dust you are, to dust you will return. But the Bible and numerous other human cultures have always also presupposed that there are deeper realities to human existence than just our dust, physical nature. We are also mind, soul, and spirit. And not only we, but all of reality, we believe, is suffused with mystery, with depth, with eternal beauty, with spirit. Not all cultures have been theistic, of course, but all cultures, until the modern post-Enlightenment West, have envisaged and lived by a multi-layered reality. I'm not saying that modern society has totally lost this vision, but I am saying that it is severely under threat. And that this has largely happened because of the dissociation of these levels from what many regard as genuine knowledge. In other words, all knowledge nowadays tends to be reduced to the level of the body. Mind, soul, and spirit have been pushed aside. Science not only has nothing to do with the other levels, worse than that, in the minds of many, science eliminates the other levels. We have come to the point of the domination of scientism, the view that science alone provides true knowledge. Ken Wilber says appropriately, full of itself and flush with stunning victories, empirical science became scientism, the belief that there is no reality save that revealed by science, and no truth save that which science delivers. The subjective and interior domains, the I and the we, were flattened into objective, exterior, empirical processes. Consciousness itself, and the mind and heart and soul of humankind could not be seen with a microscope. Just think of that quote from Hitchens of a few moments ago. And since they could not be seen with a microscope, all were pronounced epiphenomenal at best, illusory at worst. With respect to thinking about God, this shift towards scientism has had disastrous consequences. The shift began with the very beginnings of the scientific method in Galileo and Descartes. Neither of them intended any such shift. They were both, as you well know, quite religious. But sometimes ideas lead to results far beyond what their originators can possibly envisage. In fact, Peter Harrison, a professor of science and religion at Oxford University, has argued persuasively that the shift began even earlier with the Protestant Reformation. Once Luther and his heirs insisted on Scripture alone as the source of Christian doctrine, says Harrison, consequences followed that were far beyond either their desire or their ability to predict. Beyond their desires or their ability to predict. What became dominant in Protestant interpretation was the literal sense, also referred to as the grammatical or historical sense. And what they rejected were the multi-layered allegorical interpretations that had prevailed for centuries. Once again, this differentiation of the literal sense from the allegorical was a positive step forward. Much of modern biblical scholarship presupposes it. But it led to disaster because in time it led to a flattening of the meaning of scriptures to the historical sense alone, with the spiritual and faith intentions of the biblical writers becoming sidelined. I'm sure that many of you in your studies have encountered this problem when you study historical criticism. Luther, of course, had no desire for anything of the sort, but as Harrison points out, the assertion of the primacy of literal reading entailed a new, non-symbolic conception of the nature of things. As an inevitable consequence of this way of reading texts, nature would lose its meaning, and the vacuum created by this loss of intelligibility was gradually to be occupied by alternative accounts of the significance of natural things, those explanations which we regard as scientific. The point Harrison is making here is that prior to the Reformation, if you wanted to know the meaning of the physical world, you would look to the Bible and its multidimensional, symbolic way of reading. Once that was lost, a flattening starts. We see the emerging dominance of scientific explanations as early as Galileo. Like Luther, Galileo had no intention of denying the reality of mind, soul, and spirit, quite to the contrary. But again, consequences followed from his method over which he had no control. In 1623, 10 years before his trial for teaching the Copernican system, Galileo said, "I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so forth are no more than mere names so far as pertains to the human subject, wherein they seem to reside, and they only exist in the body that seems to perceive them. Thus, if living creatures were removed, all these qualities would vanish and be annihilated." Notice the pushing aside of the subject and the dominance of simply what is objective out there as the name for the truth. Descartes followed Galileo in this regard. Descartes said, this is John Caputo now describing Descartes, Descartes said that much as we love the colors, the odors and colors and feels of physical objects, as strictly rational beings, we have to give them up and concede that the only thing that is really out there, objectively, an entirely new way to talk, is mass and velocity. While such pleasant things as blue or sweet are strictly subjective or private sensations. But of course, we have to surrender. This insistence on being strictly rational is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Enlightenment. But as Caputo says, reason was being defined in a very narrow way. Whereas prior to modernity, reason was the God-given capacity to search for understanding in all areas of knowledge, during the Enlightenment, reason was increasingly seen as simply having to do with analysis of the physical world. For Descartes, God was still the origin of all things, including of the mind's capacity for reason. The problem was that Descartes tried to prove God's existence by principles derived purely from reason, and in the process, he subjected God to reason's scrutiny. It's almost as though, prior to the Enlightenment, God was first, reason came underneath. With the Enlightenment, the two flipped. So it came to the point where the discussion was whether or not God can be permitted into the realm of existence. As John Caputo says it, from a theological point of view, no matter how high you heap your praise of God, if that praise is based upon measuring God by the tests written and administered by reason, you are debasing God. It seems to me that we are in that intellectual situation today. The contrast with the ancient world could not be more dramatic. Whereas prior to modernity, God was the beginning and end of all things and of all contemplation. For the scholars of the Enlightenment, God had become one object of inquiry among others. Whereas the world had been suffused with the presence of God, so that all things were symbols and potential parables, bespeaking the deeper mystery that undergirds physical reality. The unexamined presumption of the world since the Enlightenment is that reality begins and ends with the physical. The pre-Enlightenment world presumed that there are numerous levels of reality. Our science-dominated world collapses all things to one level. That is the agony of modernity. It is not just that our science and technology have led to global warming, species existence at an unprecedented rate, industrial pollution and wars of the most horrendous kind. In addition to all of that, and adding to it, has been the loss of the human subject, the diminution and even exclusion of mind, soul, and spirit from human discourse and understanding, the debasing of God from being the giver of reason to being the problem to be solved by human debate. The task before us now is to consider where to go from here. So I'll move on to the primary thing I want to talk about tonight, the Bible and science as allies against the new atheism. Since our history suggests that we have come to this point by collapsing all of our knowledge to one level and by muting the mystery of human subjectivity, then presumably our way forward has to do with rediscovering the multi-layered character of knowing and with reasserting the central role of the human subject. With respect to the multi-layered character of reality, let me begin with a simplified version of a more complex illustration by Ken Wilber. In his attempt to integrate science and religion, Wilber did extensive research on the hierarchies which exist in numerous systems of knowledge, from systems of modern science to the ancient idea of the great nest of being. He noted that all of these hierarchies fall into one of four major types. They are called hierarchies because the earlier and more basic elements are embraced by the later and the more complex. So, for example, in the hierarchy of the natural sciences, which is top right in this illustration, but I don't have space for all of these things, atoms are embraced by molecules, which are embraced by minute organisms, which are embraced by larger, more complex bodies, and so on up the scale, from physics to chemistry, from biochemistry to biology. The four types of hierarchies are what Wilber calls, rather instructively, I think, the four corners of the known universe. My illustration is simplified, but I want to share it with you because it makes a vivid point about the different types of knowledge and how they relate to one another. It also, I think, illustrates how foolish it is for any quadrant of knowledge to deny the importance, not to mention the existence, of the other quadrants of knowledge. The upper right quadrant, physical, individual, and behavioral, is the realm of the natural sciences. It describes aspects of the exterior world. Wilber refers to it as individual and behavioral because it points to those aspects of our universe which comprise our physical bodies. This includes the animal bodies from which we have evolved and proceeds all the way to the immensely complex brains of human beings, which make us the utterly unique animals that we are. The lower right quadrant also belongs in the realm of the natural sciences, especially astronomy. It comprises the exterior collective, so it's also the realm of political science and sociology. It includes the hierarchy of the environments in which we live, from galaxies to planets, from ecosystems to cities and nations. The upper left quadrant is the realm of mind, soul, and spirit, and so it conforms in part to the old great nest of being. This is the area of interior, individual space, where sentience and intelligence develop, and where intentionality and human free will can flourish. It also comprises emotions, symbolic meaning, prayer, and contemplation. The lower left quadrant is the interior collective. It is the realm of shared interior values, and thus comprises cultures and histories, religions and worldviews as diverse as the biblical creation stories and modern cosmology, from magic to mysticism. Notice that these four quadrants complement and correspond with one another. Everything in the two right quadrants is an observable physical thing. It occupies exterior space. These two quadrants together are what our reality looks like from the outside. Everything from galaxies to cells, from cities to brains. Everything in the two left quadrants is non-physical and is not so easily observed, though much of our life is lived in these two quadrants. In fact, in the absence of these two quadrants, notice this, it's a very important point, I think, there would be no science enabling the observation of the two right quadrants. We can see here that though theology and science primarily concern themselves with separate quadrants, they are equally dependent on the realities and interior spaces of the upper left quadrant. Both theology and Bible, we might say, derive from human subjectivity, along with science. The two left quadrants are what our reality looks like from the inside, everything from subjective opinions and emotions to cultural ideas, from meditation to cosmology. Each of these quadrants has been the subject of extensive study by scholars in numerous fields. It would be foolish to deny the reality of any of the quadrants. They are all fundamental to human existence. The point I am making is a very simple one. All of reality has to it both an outside and an inside, both body, we might say, and spirit. In the aftermath of the Enlightenment, the Western world lost touch with the inner aspects of reality, reducing it at best to a position of secondary importance. With that loss has gone the ability to see our world in its totality as a physical thing, which is, at the same time, a sacrament of the deeper mystery which undergirds the world and brings it into existence. This notion of the physical world as a sacrament of deeper mystery is one of the cardinal lessons we learn from Scripture. The Scriptures will never permit us to lose sight of the inner world, the world of meaning, of God's purpose and promise. For the biblical writers of both the Old and New Testaments, and indeed for their interpreters right through to the time of the Reformation, the world was suffused with the presence of God. We can see this worldview on full display in the symbols and parables of the Bible. Words were not mere pointers. They were conveyors of power. Think for yourself of that lovely story, for instance, in the book of Numbers, 22 to 24, when Balak hires the prophet Balaam to curse Israel. And he does this because, of course, he's totally convinced, as the ancient world was, that once you curse, it will really have an effect. And Balaam believes the same thing, so every time Balaam opens his mouth, true to being hired, he wants to utter a curse, but God will permit him only to utter blessings upon Israel. Or think of Jacob renaming Ben-Oni, the child of Rachel, as she dies, when she names the child Ben-Oni. Jacob realizes that would be a disaster for the child to go through the world with that name, because Ben-Oni means child of my distress. And so Jacob renames him Benjamin, child of the right hand or child of good fortune. The ancient world presumed that the exterior thing of language, of a curse or a blessing, had an absolutely powerful interior reality. Peter Harrison, however, says that by the end of the 16th century, this world of symbolism, this world of the interweaving of natural and supernatural, was in chaos. And its once potent vision of the cosmic order, of the deeper meanings of the natural realm, of the interpenetration of natural and supernatural, was in irrevocable decline. Since symbolism has largely become foreign to us, we cannot understand the explaining of things by the use of stories. And yet, of course, Jesus used stories all the time. And he was teaching not little kindergartners, he was teaching adults. Or think of the story of David and his seduction of Bathsheba. And when the prophet Nathan wishes to rebuke him, what does he do? He tells him a story. The story you will remember of the rich man who owns numerous flocks, taking the one little ewe lamb kept as a pet by a poor man as the dinner meat. And Nathan convinces, by the style of his report, David that, in fact, he has simply heard an actual report. David pronounces judgment on the man, and then David discovers that the story is an explanation of something far deeper than a report when Nathan says to him, "You are the man." The stories, parables, proverbs, allegories were normal teaching devices of the ancient world. Truth is conveyed in the fiction of Nathan's story far beyond the recitation of mere facts. As symbols, parables presuppose that the world itself is a parable. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. Consider the grass, how it grows. Jesus spoke in parables and also acted them, you will remember. His choice of 12, eating with sinners, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. Like the word parables, these action parables depended upon the view that there is nothing in all creation, to quote Paul from Romans 8, that is outside of the love of God, or that is not in some sense meaningful as a spiritual lesson. No surprise then that this sacramental presumption of the Scriptures, the way in which the Scriptures always point beyond themselves for discovery of the Word and the presence of God, is a lesson which we can meaningfully apply as we approach the discoveries and insights of science. I'll give two quick examples, but in doing so, let me emphasize that I am not offering them as proof of the existence of God. I do not subscribe to the notion that we can prove God's existence, nor do I think personally that we should even bother trying. On the other hand, in a context where so often science is seen by some as the opponent of religion, and even as disproving God's existence, it's worth noting the extent to which science can inspire a sense of religious awe, and even lead to some measure of religious faith. Numerous scholars today, simply by their contemplation of scientific discovery, have come to regard the laws of nature as thoughts of the mind of God. That quotation is, as you can see from the top of this slide, from Anthony Flew, a British philosopher and a notorious atheist, who in recent years, however, has changed his mind about God, and he did so simply on the basis of the evidence provided by modern science. For most of his academic life, Flew was sure that in the debate about God, the unliftable burden of proof lay with believers. One of the things that changed his mind was the evidence of DNA investigations, which have shown that by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed, intelligence must have been evolved in what DNA produces, in the origin of life. The notion that life arose purely by chance is, of course, something which the new atheists really love. And it has sometimes been defended by using the analogy of a multitude of monkeys hammering randomly on a keyboard and eventually writing a Shakespearean sonnet. Anthony Flew quotes at length from Gerald Schroeder's refutation of this claim. Gerald Schroeder is an MIT trained scientist, a Jewish scholar. The likelihood of random typing on a 26-letter keyboard producing a sonnet of 488 words is 26 to the 488th power. 488 is the number of words in Shakespeare's sonnet number 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? In other words, that big number, blah, 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 10 to the 690th, which is pretty massive. If you took the entire universe, says Gerald Schroeder, and converted it to computer chips, forget the monkeys, each one weighing a millionth of a gram had each computer chip able to spin out 488 trials at, say, 1 million times a second, producing random letters. The number of trials you would get since the beginning of time would be 10 to the 90th trials. It would be off by a factor of 10 to the 600th. You will never get a sonnet by chance. The universe would have to be 10 to the 600th times larger. The world just thinks the monkeys can do it every time. I did check these numbers with Jennifer Galovich, a mathematician. I don't understand these numbers at all. She assures me that the numbers are correct. The point, of course, is that life is staggering in its complexity, and the chances of it arising by chance from inanimate matter, life from non-life, are very remote. Unless there are forces at work that steer the universe in that direction. And of course, maybe one day scientists will discover the recipe for life and be able to duplicate it in the laboratory. So theologians must not jump upon this biocentric nature of the universe as though it can prove God's existence. It doesn't prove anything of the kind, not in my opinion. Nevertheless, the realization dawning on many is that even for the conditions to exist to make life possible, long before evolution could begin its work, the forces that built the universe had to be just right, and they had to be so from the first moments of the Big Bang. Since time is running out, I'm going to skip quickly to what Martin Rees says. Martin Rees is the Astronomer Royal of England, and he reports that nothing as complex as humankind could have emerged if n were much less than that great big number. N is the number by which gravity is weaker than the electromagnetic forces, and so it's related to the fine delicacy of the force of the Big Bang. According to Paul Davies, had the Big Bang differed in strength at the outset by only 1 part in 10 to the 60th power, the universe we now perceive would not exist. The point to be explained, as Davies says, is why there is a link between the laws that create the universe and the laws that create life, and further, why there are laws that create universes in the first place. A second illustration of science as a sacrament of divine mystery does not have to do only with the discoveries of science, but also with the debates of modern philosophy. The Enlightenment represented a turn to the object. Galileo and Descartes established a scientific method as the elimination of the subjective, you will remember. The more that program proceeded, the more that subjectivity was disparaged and cast aside. Some thinkers among the new atheists have gone a long way in this direction, and they're among the most prolific writers in recent times. So I'm going to skip to a quote by Edward Wilson. Edward Wilson is a famous biologist, very famous as a biologist, a wonderful man, I'm sure, but really is to be classed among the new atheists. And notice what he says here in his book on human nature, in his describing of what the principal argument of his book is. The essence of the argument is that the brain exists because it promotes the survival and multiplication of the genes that direct its assembly. The human mind is a device for survival and reproduction, and reason is just one of its various techniques. The reflective person knows. So you have to think for yourself as a reflective person whether you agree with this. That his life is in some incomprehensible manner guided through a biological ontogeny, a more or less fixed order of life stages. The first problem with such a view of the human mind is that if it is true, if the human mind is just a survival machine for genes, then how in the world did the mind ever get to a place where it could work this out? How in the world did it ever become reflective? At this point, it seems to me that scientific materialism, the new atheism, flies in the face of common sense. And again, I'm going to skip because I really want to have time for discussion. So, the worst aspect of scientific materialism, in my view, is its denial of the significance of the human subject, as though our accounts of what reality is must be based simply on the objective facts out there without attending to the knower, the human person, who is accomplishing all of this knowing. Let me put it this way. Science properly insists that our material nature, the chemical composition of our bodies and our descent from animals are clues to the nature of the universe. But material, external nature is not all there is to us. There are also interior quadrants. We have unique human qualities, capacities for transcendence, meaning and truth, as expressed in art, science, philosophy, and religious contemplation. But are not these also clues to the nature of the universe? As you can see, I couldn't resist quoting myself. If we're going to take into account all of the evidence, we must reckon with every level of reality which the universe and ordinary experience lay before us. Science is an endless store of riches in that regard. Taken in its full context, not only objective facts, but also the passionate commitments and desire for truth of the knower, science witnesses clearly to the depths of human mystery and the mystery of the reality from which we have emerged. In our explorations of the mystery, we sell ourselves short if we do not take into account every aspect of knowing, every field of meaning, and all of our capacities for discerning truth. Not only science, but also poetry, philosophy, art, theology reveal us to ourselves. And I do have more, but since I'm absolutely dying to know if you have any thoughts or questions, I'm going to stop. Of course, if you don't have any questions, I'll just keep on going, so you better have some. Thank you very much.
If I could call us back together for conversation, questions, additions, etc.
Or suggestions or disagreements, of course. Yes, please.
I'm writing a book on the beliefs of the people that call themselves spiritual but not religious. And I just want to know your opinion on this. I'm writing a book on the people that call themselves spiritual but not religious, their beliefs in particular. And I vacillate between thinking that they have some kind of inchoate longing for something that we've kind of have had beaten out of us, and that's good. Yeah. And seeing them as not having the tools to actually do anything about it. Yeah. So I'm kind of torn. Do you think that connects with this? Because a lot of them want they want alternatives to science. Alternative medicine and all that.
Right.
A lot of spiritual techniques, Reiki and things that, they feel are changing their bodies. So do you have an opinion on that as it relates?
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is that when I hear, and I sometimes hear students say that kind of thing, they'll say, well, I'm not very religious, but I am spiritual. I often think that comes out of a sort of a naivete, because, of course, they're making a distinction there, which is kind of a strange distinction for those of us who are religious. Religious and spiritual, in our view, there are no distinctions between them. But I think that what they're saying very often is that they are not institutionally religious. They don't want to be associated with a denomination or a particular religious creed. And I think they're also being a little bit naive with respect to history. They need to, when people want an alternative to the monological science, as Ken Wilber describes it, this thing which is science as the only way to look at the world. When they want an alternative to that, one of the things that they really need to do is to look at how did we get to this point? where science simply took over. And they need to recognize that as far as most of the world is concerned, the Western world in this regard is just crazy. The vast majority of cultures of the world just do not see things in this flatland manner. So I think that what needs to happen for people in the modern world is to understand that spirituality has always been there in all religions. And that religion, its good and its bad parts, have come out of something which is innately spiritual about human beings. We need to recognize that about ourselves. But be honest of what has happened, that the Western world has painted itself into this corner, this strange cul-de-sac that we're trapped in right now. Please.
There are you mentioned three things: art, religion, and science. Art, religion, and science being the components of our
Those great
existence.
cultural values, yeah.
Yeah, and both religion and science have to be done in groups, and large groups that can argue with each other, but art can be done, poetry, so forth, individually. Do you see a mediating role for art as well?
Do I see a mediating role for? Yes, I certainly do. Let me leave us with this diagram here. Since art is so expressive of just so much of what's in society, whether it's the emotional or the intellectual, or where people perceive society to be, its evils and its beauties and so on, then it's deeply expressive of the inside of human beings. I mean, we see it in the St. John's Bible, right? I mean, where the art is trying to express a spirituality, but it is doing it at the same time, I suppose you could also say, with an amazing both modern and ancient technology all at the same time. So, I mean, I think the reason why those three things need to be seen properly differentiated, but at the same time properly in relation to one another. That there is not one without the others. You can, no more than you can take any one of these quadrants out and have the fullness of reality, neither can you take any of them out and have the fullness of human existence. So, yes, I think art has I'm not an artist, so I'm not going to be able to say much, but it has often struck me that art has a fantastic role to play in the mediation between something like science and spirituality, absolutely. I think we should remember that science itself is an art. The importance of beauty, for instance, in the equations of the physicists is something which they absolutely insist upon. Paul Dirac said it's more important to have beauty in your equation than for it to match up with experiment. Which strikes me as a stunning thing to say, but he said it. And he's one of the greatest physicists, apparently, of the 20th century. So, yes, please.
I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit further about the hermeneutical development that happened with the Protestant Reformation and that flattening that you discussed early on in your talk.
Let me recommend to you the book by Peter Harrison. It's called The Bible, Protestantism, and the Rise of Modern Science. It's a wonderful, wonderful study. And he shows in the first part of the book how in the medieval world, but really going from the ancient world, he goes all the way back to Augustine and Origen, the kind of the first great interpreters of the Bible, how they used the quadriga. In biblical scholarship, what that means is the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical levels of Scripture. I'm sure the monks here are all very familiar with this stuff. And they knew of the literal, but they never regarded it as absolutely essential. It was something of a guide, but on occasion you might just let it go completely. What they really tended to look for were what they called the spiritual sense of Scripture, which they gained from allegorical methods, anagogical methods, looking at how Scripture tells you of future hope and eternal salvation, and of course the moral methods. What his thesis is, and he argues for this very persuasively. I think, I'm sure he's right, at least to some extent, although these things are always extremely complex. But he makes the case that at the time of the Reformation, what Luther did, and in fact Luther did, he published a copy of the Psalms without, for the first time in close to 1,000 years, well, no, that wouldn't be true because they weren't that ancient. But anyway, for the first time in centuries, he published a copy of the Psalms without in the margins having the little hints about how to interpret these things from the fathers of the church. He just made everybody focus on the letter of the text. Now, we know why Luther did that, and he did not intend thereby to be taking out the spiritual sense of Scripture. But what the effect of it was that as that progressed through the time of the Reformation, that he was taking out all of those multiple level ways of looking at Scripture. And therefore he was saying the Bible no longer has the function which it has always had of giving you these allegorical and symbolic senses. And so the flattening to the literal sense meant that you had to interpret, since the Bible was the hermeneutical framework within which you looked not just at the Bible, you looked at the entirety of creation through the eyes of the Bible. Once you flattened the sense of the Bible itself, you started to flatten the sense of how to look at the universe as a whole, how to look at the physical world. And Harrison maintains that that was one of the great spurs to the rise of natural science, because that more and more impelled people towards just try to explain things in a physical sense. Again, that's part of the dignity of modernity. It's a good thing in many respects. But it also meant that we lost the capacity to see the physical world as a sacrament of something deeper, which it is. And in that, all of that stuff that I was talking about with the Bible and its parables and its symbols, of course, I'm not suggesting for one moment that we therefore should be taking all of that stuff seriously and make ourselves the naive interpreters of the physical world, which they were in ancient times. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that their sense of the physical as sacrament of the spiritual is something that we need to regain. And in fact, modern neuroscience is showing that, in fact, that's the kind of thing that we do, in fact, have to do. And we have a natural propensity for it, and it's the kind of thing that we do need to do. Please.
Going on.
Sure, use the microphone. Good.
As a follow-up to that flattening of dimension, how does that apply to the born-again biblical fundamentalist view of religion and its antagonistic ways to science?
Right. To me, the fundamentalists flip over to the other side way too much. They, since they want to see the Bible as the sole authority for knowledge, and therefore anything that science might say that they perceive as in competition with the Bible, they flip to the point of rejecting, what other forms of knowledge will reveal to us about the universe. They don't just reject science, remember, they reject much of modern arts, they reject much of modern culture more widely, they reject modern philosophy. So they just want to flatten everything to the knowledge which we can gain in the Bible, and the Bible interpreted in very one level, monological level of meaning. And so they go to the opposite extreme of the people like Dawkins who want to see everything just in terms of science.
I guess to the spectrum, the opposite extreme of the spectrum, I guess you could say.
Exactly. Yes, we're right now we have this kind of war going on two fronts. We have the new atheists who want to tell us that everything is just to be explained at the level of the physical, That's all that we need. And we have extreme religious fundamentalists who want to tell us, don't trust the science at all, just go with our sacred texts. We have to, this is no news to all of you, we have to learn that the numerous ways and levels and manners of knowledge which we have from the mind of God are the ways in which we need to perceive both texts and the deeper reality of the world around us. Thank you. Please.
Perhaps just a comment, but it seems that you have a wonderful ally in Pope Benedict XVI in his recent trip to Germany, talking about natural law versus secularism, and perhaps his continuous plea to bring God back into the public square, which is kind of what we're talking about here, I think.
Yeah. I like what Benedict, I don't think I'm familiar with what you might be referring to just now, but I do like the writings of Benedict on faith and reason, and the way that faith and reason belong together. He has written some wonderful things in that regard. And yes, I agree, he's an ally. I get upset with him occasionally, however, for all kinds of reasons. But one of the reasons I get upset with him is because in some respects, he actually refuses to look at the science. And that, I think, is problematic, especially the social sciences. He does not like the social sciences. And I think he's shooting us in the foot at that point. But yes, overall, his bringing together of faith and reason, he's wonderful on that theme. Yeah. Yes. Okay, no worries. Yes, go ahead.
Up here, speaking of social sciences, but I wanted to talk about psychology a little bit and where that fits into these four corners.
Right.
Because it is an interior study, but it's also physical, behavioral, in some sense. Also, could you comment on the fact that we have a very subjective world right now? We have our iPhones or whatever, we have Facebook, we have all these things that are about us and the self. But then we have these sciences that are so empirical and objective. How do they converse, and what would you say about that difference? And where does theology fit into there? That's a lot to throw.
Yeah,
I'm
do we have
sorry.
another 3 hours? Wilbur himself, and I completely agree with this, places psychology in the upper left quadrant, of course. So he puts it in the interior, individual, and intentional. I think you're right, and I think he would agree with you that, of course, something like psychology is also dealing in the right-hand quadrant. That's true. In fact, I think that's really an important point. I think all of these quadrants, in fact, touch upon one another. A better way of representing this illustration would really be in 3 dimensions, and you would really have to see an organic unity, and you'd have to see a kind of a flow from one to the other. But I think that's really important because without the upper left quadrant, without human symbol-seeking, searching for reality as an abstract thing, but trying to understand it nevertheless, we would not have the upper right quadrant. All of the stuff where you can put it under a microscope or examine it at the end of a telescope. Now, how that relates to, that's a really massive question, how that relates to, all of this kind of personal stuff of iPhones and Facebook and so on, and how they relate to exterior science, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that a great deal more than I have time for right now. I'm quite certain that what those things do attest to me, they're symptomatic of what this lady was saying about our desire for alternatives to the cold, monological world which science is tending to produce. We're desperately reaching out to really be a community and we're doing it through technology. To me, there's something both good and dangerous about that. I think that we need to think about those things really carefully. John?
Just a quick comment. Somebody else who has another question. But I was thinking rather than having it flat, putting those four at the 4 points of a tetrahedron so that it's three-dimensional.
Yeah, except I don't know how to do that. Yes.
Well, one striking absence in your beautiful synopsis here is the lack of Thomism, which I...
Yes. Somebody reminded me of that at the break, and I completely agree, but go ahead.
Well, anyway, Jacques Maritain, he worked out a very coherent classical understanding of the degrees of knowledge, rooted in Aristotle, and basically the division between physica and metaphysica. And his argument is similar to yours, that there was somehow in the late 19th and into the 20th century this huge reversal that basically put philosophy and theology where science had been.
Right.
It's sort of fundamental stuff you can mess with, but it's not all that important.
Right.
And I think his instructions are great. I still go back to that great work of his, The Degrees of Knowledge, because he sees this movement of the mind as a natural thing that we naturally aspire. And I think the two thinkers, recent thinkers that I've come across that have really helped me to see this are Mary Midgley. Do you know what that?
Yes, British kind of social biologist. Yes.
Well, yeah, she has this wonderful way of just saying, part of what this movement toward reason proffered us in the 20th century were all these quasi-gospels.
Right.
Marx becomes gospel,
Right.
Freud becomes gospel,
Right.
Physics becomes gospel.
Yeah.
And so she steps back and looks at that and talks about, not necessarily justifying it against the gospel, but let's accept this at least as the reductionist tendency.
Yes.
And I think at that level, science can be criticized, and sometimes harshly. I don't think we should stand away and say, well, we can't say anything about Darwin, it's such a coherent system. I think there's a lot we can criticize about that. Like, for instance, it's never really been proved.
Well,
it's beautiful, it's maybe it works that way, but I've never really seen it. No one's ever shown me that, oh yeah, this happens. It makes sense to me, but I think it could be criticized, and a lot of other science could be criticized. No one's ever seen a black hole. Maybe some guy through telescopes has, but I never have. For me to, I think, to try to simply balance it back out, for me, is a way of saying maybe what Charles Taylor says. Where he would put into this whole schema that you presented here is the human hunger for enchantment.
Right.
And what the Reformation and what the push for reason and empiricism really did was smother enchantment.
Right.
And as we see in our culture, it has a way of coming back at us, but it's so devoid of substance. We get Hollywood, we get Walt Disney. That's their answer to enchantment for us,
Right.
And compared to what we know about in our tradition of religion, of faith practice, Jewish and Christian, and even to some extent Islam, I would say that an area where we could find commonality in the world is where Charles Taylor is pointing us. Let's look at enchantment. Let's
Right.
look at that human fundamental desire for apprehending the world as sacrament or mystery.
Right. But, I agree with most of what you're saying, but I really have to disagree with you when it comes to you have to see it for yourself in order to believe it. We don't even believe that about religion, and we certainly shouldn't believe it about science either. The science is reliable. The science is solid. It's not the science which has led us astray. It's the interpretation of the science which has led us astray. And it's the fact that we have become so fascinated with science as the be-all and end-all that we have then, as Ken Wilber says, we have allowed science to kind of run all of the other cultural values off of the map and just, you know, stick them in a ditch on the side of the road. And that's the problem. But the science itself is completely reliable, and in fact, science itself, I think, properly understood, is as much of a witness to transcendence as is theology. And we need to recognize that fact. Science itself is a transcendent topic, and it brings many people to some sort of a faith, some sort of a sense of wonder and spirituality. So I disagree with you about, you know, distrust the science. It has to be proven first. No, the science is reliable. It's what we do with it that's the problem.
Well, I mean, as far as Darwinism goes, I guess the first application of Darwinism became social Darwinism. You know, it's like.
But again, it was an interpretation. That wasn't right. Darwin himself.
Exactly, that's right. But that's how it gets. That's how it got fostered. And I agree. He does have a beautiful intuition. I mean, to see the dynamic in the way that it is. But I get nervous when people refer to like the theory of evolution as fact. They state it as fact, and it's really theory.
Yeah. Talk to a biologist about that. I assure you they will back it up with lots of facts. I think this lady might get the last word.
I want to be respectful. Please.
I was listening to that. I was wondering.
The microphone, right? Okay, yes, go ahead.
Listening to your discussion, it made me think about well, I wonder if there's a way in which postmodern relativism somehow leads to a need for that level of objectivity. And I was thinking about, at least in Europe where I live, multiculturalism seems to be leading to a really big backlash of almost fascism. We have a 26% share in our government of right wing in Holland.
Right. Ah, okay. Yeah, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that one. I think the best that I can say is I would need to study the issue. Yeah, I'm not ready to answer that. I'm sorry. But thank you. And thank you all. It's really been a pleasure.